This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Welcome to the House of Wisdom, Ahval's podcast for book talks on the Middle East and more. Today, my guest is Louis Fishman, an associate professor at Brooklyn College at City University of New York. His area of expertise includes state building, nationalism, with a particular focus on Palestine, Israel, and Turkey. His recent book, Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Era, 1908-1914, Claiming the Homeland, analyzes how the Young Turks Revolution and the new constitutional freedoms exacerbated divisions between the communities rather than serving as a unifying factor. Louis, congratulations on your book and welcome to the House of Wisdom.
Thanks so much and great to be here with you.
You have conducted many years of research for this book. Why don't we begin with your data collection stories and maybe some research stories as well?
Yeah, thanks for the great question to start off with, because of course I think we forget that this is my I've done many things since graduating with my PhD at Chicago. This originally was my dissertation topic, and the dissertation changed quite a bit from dissertation of book. Everyone will know that that's a struggle for so many academics. How do you change? What I say is that you build up this building, and then they say, wow, what a beautiful building it is. Okay. And then they say, okay, well, when you go to the book stage, they say, well, we really loved it. It was a great project, but the second floor should be in the fourth floor. You should knock down that whole basement. We don't need a basement, and add an attic to it. So what really is, the book is quite different than the dissertation. But I have so many good memories, from doing research, and it really goes back to when I finished my coursework at University of Chicago. I was working with Professor Rashid Khalidi on Palestinianism, or I call it Palestinianism now, Palestinian identity and the history of Palestinians. But I also did great work with the late Menachem Brinker on Hebrew poetry and Hebrew culture, and I had so many different classes, and I was doing a major also. I was doing a minor in Islamic history, so I had a great experience there. And by chance, it was I got a job at Bilkin, so that sort of got me to Turkey in '99 to 2001, and it was a different era back then. I mean, Israel and Turkey relations were very, very strong, for better or for worse. I'm not coming from a very pro-state vision of how they understand the conflict or understand relations, but it was an experience to be there. And finally, in 2002, I got a grant, a Fulbright, to study in Istanbul, in the archives. So I had already done a summer program in Ahval. It was the Harvard Bursa program. Now it's a Harvard Coach program. It's just an amazing place to study. You study Osmanlıca, Ottoman language on this island in the Aegean Sea, next to Aegean Sea. It was just beautiful. I wish I would have studied a bit more, because when I got to the archives, I said, what am I going to do? This is a really, really hard language. And I, as a traditional Middle East historian, starting at Haifa University, we were, Arabic was good, Hebrew was great. But Turkish was new, and when I got to the archives, I found that it was a real struggle to get the documents, to work with the documents. But once I started getting used to it. It took me about 2 years off and on in the archives to really come up. Now the archives are very different today, because you just go to a search engine and you pull that up, and you can type Zionism, Zionism, or you can type Philistine, and you get hundreds of topics. But then we had big indexes where we'd go and then we'd look up that, look it up, and we'd go and order each one that we thought was interesting. So it was a much longer process. Although I think search engines give us too much information sometimes. We'll come to that maybe in a few minutes when we talk about the newspapers. Work in the Ottoman archives, I think I was one of the first ones, I think, that worked that much in depth on Zionism. To tell you the truth, I had thought I would find more. And now that I'm more experienced, now that the book is out, I'm going back and I'm seeing there are things that I missed. There are a lot of young scholars that are doing great work on the history of Palestine, Eretz Israel, the Holy Land, Palestine. So that work is going to be left for them, and maybe I'll go back into it. I think one of the funnier moments I had was when someone from the archives came to me and said, "Oh, we found something from your Ataturk," and I was like, "What are you talking about?" Well, in long story short, it was letters from Theodor Herzl to Sultan Abdulhamid II. So that was a really exciting moment, and I remember getting it and being in shock. Like, why? That's when the archives it's now in Kalatani, but before, which I haven't been to the new ones. But before it was right in Sultan Ahmed, very close to Hagia Sophia. So I remember walking around saying, "Oh, this is just amazing." And that night I checked and I found out they were recorded in Herzl's diary. So it wasn't a huge find. It wasn't nothing new or something like that. But that was an exciting moment, I would tell you. The other things is I think I just found out that in doing research, you really just can't look for keywords. You really have to look at the documents. You really have to explore the documents. Because the Haram al-Sharif incident, which is the third chapter of the book, which came out first as an article, really showed me that if we look for Zionism, out of 150 pages, it really isn't related to Zionism. Now, what made me understand, is that when we talk about Palestinianism or looking at the history of local patriotism of Palestinians, we see that there's so much in the archives that we need to look at. And we need to understand the Palestinians as a people, as the majority people there, that has their own history that's not really related at all to Zionism or at times colonialism. In this case, it was a mix of two things. So I think going to archives for any historian is a real adventure. And the idea is, if I could give any advice, would to be open to look beyond what you think is what might you expect there, because that really is how one's topic shifts, changes, develops in its own unique work.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'd like to ask a follow-up question about Palestinianism, the term that you introduced. So you wrote that a major shortcoming in the literature on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is the lack of attention dedicated to understanding the makeup of each people and their formation into a distinct identity. So could you please explain your term Palestinianism and explain how your book filled the vacuum?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's actually quite simple, and I think it was actually coming from Hebrew and knowing Turkish. We say Filistinlilik. We have that lik form in Turkish, which means the essence of being Palestinian, or Palestinian youth, or iyut in Hebrew. We have the iyut part of it in Hebrew, the essence of being. And I noticed that when we speak English, we're writing about Palestinians, everyone's saying, well, was it nationalism? Then we were saying proto-nationalism, which we don't really say anymore. But was it, what was it? Are they a people? Are they not a people? So I wanted to get past that and started defining things that actually shows a modern nation, a modern people, that we don't have to, they don't have to come out and say it's a nationalism for it to be, for them to have some kind of Palestinian identity. Rashid Khalidi he had already written, almost over 2 decades ago about Palestinian identity. So I was coming with the idea clearly that there's a Palestinian identity. What I wanted to see was, looking at local patriotism. And how do we define this? And how do we define this over the last century? That Palestinianism, I would say, transforms quite a bit, and the Arab countries themselves, Arab identity, that shift or that teeter-totter of, on one hand, going towards more of a local identity versus a more, a larger identity of Arab identity, or that hits a height in the 50s of pan-Arabism under Abdel Nasser and later on the Ba'ath Party to some extent. So I think I wanted to to say, okay, first let's define what makes them Palestinian. And I started looking. Once I looked at that lens, I think it was relieving for me to open up and say, wow, now I can actually get what makes them Palestinian. So, for example, we have this whole controversy that I think I think a lot of times controversies are in a sense made up, and they're very political at times, and the essence of controversies. But this question of, did they identify as Palestinians, or did they identify the land as Palestine? Now, you have two sides that bring this into a sort of controversial topic. One hand, of course, the Zionist narrative and different Jewish histories, different Zionist histories. I don't want to define them just as Zionist histories of Israel. Also, inherently deny Palestinians' existence. We know that that's not, and that entered the American sphere also. That's very clear. There was no such thing as a Palestinian people before. On the other hand, you have this idea of Greater Syria. And I don't see Greater Syria. Yes, there's connections between Palestinians and Syrians. They're both Arabs living in the Mashriq. I don't see ever in at least the period I'm working in that much to show that they had this idea of Syria Kubra or Greater Syria, which is really, I think, a post-1917 phenomenon. So this overemphasis on them being Syrian actually undermined us as scholars to understand that, yes, there was Palestine. So, for example, my book, I just bring up the Tuborg beer advertisement. And that's really interesting in itself because it asks questions, how can alcohol advertisement be in a newspaper right next to a long lecture by Haji Raghib al-Khalidi about religion and different things. It's a Christian-owned paper, but still, they have religious topics that are discussed there. So today it'd be very strange to see an alcohol commercial next to each other, next to one of these talks or speeches, and so on the bottom it says, if you want to, so beyond the other interests that I don't touch on, it just says, contact the distributor in Syria or Palestine who want to sell that beer in your bakal, basically in your small shop. So that's why I'm saying that us as historians, sometimes we remain stuck on things that during the period, if you write it from that period, it wasn't controversial at all. Everyone was calling it Palestine. There's nothing, it really is that you see it, the newspapers called Palestine. Numerous people talk about Palestine. And by 1908 to 1914, they start using modern terminology to describe themselves. Palestinian people is Shab al-Falastini, Ahal al-Falastin, Ehali Falastin, different things like this. Palestinian, Palestinians. So what that means is a different question altogether, of course, right? That's as historians, we have to define, what that was. I define it as a local patriotism, but this local patriotism by 1914 really develops into people writing and setting out to claim the homeland. So I think that is something, claiming the homeland for me is not saying we need Palestinians or the Jewish community, which we can talk about in a second, not saying, oh, we want an independent homeland. No, we want to progress our agenda and have the Ottoman Empire recognize our special connection with that land of Philistine, with Palestine. So I think if we look at this, we get a whole new, once you accept that, it really, I think it's a relief in a way that we're able to move on and we're able to talk about what makes them Palestinian. And that's why I talk about, just in short, it's the mutual struggle. It's the Christian editors taking up the cause of the peasant. It's the notables realizing that, if people are leaving Palestine, because I want to tell you something, what's the most interesting thing is that when they talk about Zionism, they're not only talking about Jews coming, they're talking about Palestinians leaving. And no historian had ever noticed that, I don't think. I think one or two had mentioned it, but it's in every petition. They are coming, we are leaving. And we are leaving villages to Jaffa, from Jaffa to go to South America or America. Okay, now let me end by saying that the notables, if they don't have the village Mukhtars there, if the Mukhtars don't have peasants on their land, then what is the importance of the village Mukhtar? So we start seeing that all these different groups are connecting together. There's one group that does not connect with them, and that's the Jewish community. And we can talk about that now.
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
It's a great start. I like to come to this era of Young Turks Revolution and these expectations from each community. So Muslims, Christians, Jews in Palestine all together celebrated the revolution. And
Absolutely.
you know that when the Ottoman Parliament was open, it was home to multi-ethnic representation with 26 Greek deputies, 14 Armenians, 4 Jews, many Arabs and Albanians, and a slim majority of Turks. Some historians highlight the positive intercommunal relations across religious lines, and some others argue against romanticizing the time period. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think mine is more of a middle road. Yes, they all, the problem is that and I think a lot of the research has looked correctly at the intercommunal relations, but it was very limited in my opinion. And why so? Let's look at the Jewish community quickly in Palestine, and then I'm gonna look at the Ottoman Jewish community, because the two are very, very interconnected. And I think that's something we really need to write in the Jewish community in Palestine, including a lot of the Ashkenazis, as being part of this greater Ottoman world. But let's look at first the Jewish community. Yes, Jews, whether they were Arab Jews, which is a bit of a controversial term, or Jews that spoke Arabic, in fact, they started defining themselves. Quite a few people I worked on some new work as Arab Jews, or whether they were Jewish immigrants at the time that had been there 20 years. What we see is that in the Young Turk Revolution, each group is talking about equality. Each group is saying, Musavet, the idea of equality and adalet, justice, and they have different ideas. But the real idea is that they're all rallying around this new sense of citizenship and becoming Ottomans, and modern Ottomans. Now, for the Palestinian notables, I think it goes back, you have to bring it back to the first constitutional period. Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi is represented, in the new parliament that's suspended by Abdul Hamid II eventually, which leads to the second constitutional period and the Young Turk Revolution. So you had already, I think, Jerusalem connecting itself very closely to Istanbul for this during the post-Tanzimat era. That Jerusalem always seems to me, I've been saying this over and over again, sort of a suburb of Istanbul. They're really close to it. But these ideas and these notions of equality, everyone celebrates equality, but they don't realize that for each group, it means something very, very different. And what I argue is that the new reforms places these communities in competition in what I call renegotiating the millet system. And renegotiating the millet system is interesting because suddenly Palestinians who are Muslims and Christians are in some sense placed in almost its own millet. Okay, and I think that's something very radical to say, and I think we need to work more on that. And I am working on a paper that hopefully in December, I'll be presenting on that topic itself. But the Jewish community at this time started saying, and that's across the board, let's look at other non-Muslim communities and see how they are going to achieve this idea of equality. And that's really when we get them looking towards Armenians and Greeks and the language issue. The language issue is now, we want Hebrew to be a spoken language among us, taught in our schools. And and these are also all the Jews that their mother tongue is Arabic also. That should be very clear. Hebrew is going to be the main language. That's the Ashkenazi immigrant paper, Hatzvi, by Eliezer ben Yehuda, so the father of modern Hebrew. That's all. That's Hachirut, which is a Sephardic newspaper also. So Hebrew becomes something, I would say, a project. I almost slipped and said a state project. It's a project of the Jewish Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Palestine as a whole. So once you have this, yes, you have this idea of equality with the Palestinians, but you're not looking anymore towards horizontal equality, what I call it, this idea that everyone's truly equal. Rather, it's more of a equal playing field for each group to demand their rights, vis-a-vis a Muslim secular elite in Istanbul. And that is going to carry over to the modern Turkish state also. This idea that the modern secular elite, in essence, replaces the system of the previous millet system of, them having to pay taxes, different things like that, which is a pre-modern system, by the way. I'm not coming to say that there were, of course, there were inequalities in the Ottoman Empire. There was inequalities across the board in the Ottoman Empire. It's just not non-Muslims. You could go, between peasants, between notables, and who goes to the army, who doesn't go to the army, different things like that. But in the 1908, there's something new, a dynamic that's placed, and that's the Muslim secular elite in Istanbul dictating to each group what they're going to be. Now, as a result of this, the Palestinians started seeing that the Jewish community, once again, whether it's the local Jewish community, whether it's the community of immigrants, smaller community of immigrants, whether it's Ashkenazi or Sephardic, I call it the hodgepodge of communities, because you have Jews from Bukhara, present-day Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, you have Persian Jews, you have far majority, I would say, or large part, are the Ladino-speaking Jews of the Ottoman Empire, originally from Spain. So all these start coming together, rallying around Hebrew. And that really creates this new sense of identity. Now, going back to your point about the Ottoman Parliament, what's interesting is at this time, a new sense of Zionism emerges out into the open among public officials throughout the empire, especially in Istanbul, the Western coast, the Aegean areas, where Zionism is now adopted as sort of a pride in Jewish culture. And that really changes our understanding of Zionism completely. So let me say that if we look at and you have someone like Nissim Mazlia, who is a parliamentarian, and he defends Zionism tooth and nail to say that Zionists have a right to an autonomous Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, by 1912, due to a different reason, not connected whatsoever to Palestinians and their complaints, Zionism becomes, during this period, wrapped up in conspiracy theories that we can talk about in a second. We can come back to that. But up into the earlier years, for many of the Zionists, Ottoman Zionists, and they want to define themselves as Zionists, they would say we're Ottoman Jews who are proud to have Hebrew in our kindergarten classes. But the main language has to be Turkish. It was a modern movement to also Turkify the Jewish community while holding on to this Hebrew, which they only knew for prayer. They didn't speak Hebrew with each other. Remember that among the Ottoman communities, the only daily speaking community by then, 1908, was the Jewish community. And they have 3 newspapers by this period. So Palestinian has 3 main newspapers: Palestine, Carmel, Al-Quds Sharif for the Palestinians. The Jewish community has Hachirut, Moria, which is more of a religious newspaper, Ashkenazi newspaper, surprisingly not Zionist. And then Hatzvi, which is a Zionist paper by one of the original immigrants from the first Aliyah, the 1881 to 1903 period, Eliezer ben Yehuda. You can read Moria and you can read Hachirut, one Zionist, one not Zionist. They're almost identical. It really starts this idea that they are a community. Zionism is still, no one's really clear what this is among the Ottoman officials, because among the Jews, it's also not clear. And then I think that's an important. It is a really, and let me just finish here. It's really interesting because Rabbi Chaim Nachum, the chief rabbi, has always been seen as the anti-Zionist. He was anti-Zionist. Albert Entebbe, a Syrian Jew who was in charge of the Alliance School, anti-Zionist. But we have confused this because they were never anti-Jewish immigration to Palestine. They were pro-immigration. They were pro-Jews getting rights based on this new system. They were against an independent state. And to sum up about the Jewish community in Palestine could not foresee that the Ottoman Empire is going to fall. It's very important. And even the Zionist movement in Berlin by 1910, 1911 come to the conclusion that they're going to accept this autonomous Jewish homeland, that a state is not within reach. And that really changes so much there that we've really, as you know, we've really misread, I think, Palestinianism, but we also misread the local Zionist culture that was very much in tune with the other non-Muslim communities in the area, including, by the way, you had Jewish communities very much like Palestine in Anatolia during these years. I'm working on that now. One, they even call it kibbutz. So it's interesting. And what did they want to do? They wanted to speak Hebrew where? In the middle of Anatolia. It really confuses matters, I think, once it's not, there's not a really easy answer of what it was during this moment.
Yeah, as a follow-up question, because you traced the trajectory of Zionism in the book as well, and you noted that some Zionist officials renounced their ambitious goals after the Young Turk Revolution and decided to work within the Ottoman system. So how serious was the internal friction about Zionists? You mentioned about about Jewish community, these frictions or debates and such. Is it possible to trace the frictions among Zionisms?
Absolutely, you can. You can go to the newspapers. There are numerous debates in Hachirut about what the Jewish Yishuv should look like. What does it mean to be Zionist in this period? What does it mean to be a modern Jew during this period? And there's debates, roaring debates over Hebrew. We know this, the war in Hebrew, that was, I would say that the Zionist institutions for Berlin preferred to have German as an official language within the new school systems. And no, the local Jewish population says absolutely not, it's going to be Hebrew. So this really unites them. The other thing is that, of course, the friction you see also is in Istanbul, where you have Zionist lobbying, you have a Zionist newspaper network also, and it's not really clear to the Ottomans, who this group is and what are they trying to achieve. So I think that the frictions is in the fact that, as you saw in the book, that when they start debating the Zionism in the parliament, they're actually talking about a plan by Israel Zangwill to buy a strip of land in Iraq to settle Jews, which was not at all Zionist, it was territorialist, right? And so there's friction between the ones in Palestine saying, no, Jewish migration should be only to the Holy Land, to Eretz Israel, to Palestine. On top of that, you have frictions between people, Ashkenazi Jews born and raised in Palestine, who become very Ottoman. One of them is Karmi Effendi, who dies as a Ottoman Hebrew soldier. He defined himself as an Ottoman Hebrew soldier. His brother-in-law, Gad Frumkin, and his father-in-law, Aaron Eisenberg, Karmi's father, set up a group in a company in Istanbul called Netayim. And Netayim is going to be this pro-Ottoman agricultural settlement company that's going to legitimize Jewish settlement and be able to buy land through being a legal organization within the Ottoman Empire. So they're a registered company. Now, Gad Frumkin, the same person, he's able to get a job in Istanbul to the Jewish Morning Journal from New York. I'm looking at New York right now from my window. So from the Lower East Side. That's sort of how he's paid. He enters the parliament. He's meeting politicians all the time. Okay. So one of the plans was, and I only wrote about this in a few sentences, and I need to develop it more, but was to bring Jews first to Istanbul, to raise a Jewish community there, and then maybe in 20 or 30 years, convince the Ottomans to give the Jews a homeland, autonomous homeland. This is not an independent state, autonomous homeland in Palestine. So they really saw, this is 1913, 14. They're not able to see that the Ottomans are going to fall. And they said, we need to do long-term investments. We need to convince the Zionist organization in Berlin to support us. Zionist organization pulls their support for it. They say, no, if we're going to support immigration, it's only going to be Palestine. So yeah, there you see frictions there. I would love to develop. I think the question is a brilliant question, and I wish I do it more. And when you asked me that, I was thinking, wow, that's really, what are the frictions? There are frictions. For example, Hafirut talks about, look at those Arabs succeeding to get special autonomous rights from the Ottomans. So they say, Arab nationalism is a great copy for us to, we should copy Arab nationalism, their tactics and motivations to receive autonomy. So, we always hear about years later, Palestinians learned about nationalism from the Jews. This is one of the biased or made up myths of the history. But actually, the Jews are looking to Arabs to learn how to gain special rights in the land. So really, once you go, like I said, when you go back to this period, it's fascinating because you learn so many things that we think it's the opposite, or we've been taught that it was opposite, and it's different. Let me lastly talk about frictions. Is go to Ben Gurion, and this idea is, I really want to, I think Zionist history, just like Palestinian history, needs to be rethought out and rewritten. Because what do we see until now? We see a very clear division of Jews coming in the 1880s, settling 20 or 30 settlements into 1903, a more traditional community. Then we see the more socialist Zionists coming in 1905 to 1914, which is called the second Aliyah. First wave of immigration, the second wave of immigration. My book tries to problematize this and say that the history that we're learning, the history of settlement, the history of the pioneers, to the great extent was overblown by the labor movement in the 1920s and 30s, who become the dominant movement up until 1977. This narrative has been adopted not just by Zionist scholars, but also to a great deal by Palestinian scholars, I would say. Okay, this sort of, the over focus on settlements and not looking at the urban communities. So that's when we look at Ben Gurion, for example. Everyone knows that he studied in Istanbul, but no one does anything with it. Because if you start saying, why was he in Istanbul? Well, he was going to get Ottoman citizenship, and he wanted Jewish representation where? In the Ottoman parliament. Remember, Jews aren't represented in Ottoman parliament in Jerusalem. The far majority are not citizens of the Ottoman state to begin with. And that should be pointed out. So you have 3 Arab representatives, and that means the Arab representatives in Palestine are dependent also on the Jewish vote. Okay, so what you hear from Palestinian representatives is somewhat censored, self-censored, because they're needing to get the Jewish vote also at the same time. So I think really we need to look at this. And Ben Gurion went there perhaps to become a parliament member in the and that in itself is fascinating, how so quickly he immigrates in 1905, so quickly that he's able to see this. But once again, if we if we look on the focus on this, it breaks the narrative of the very smooth narrative of from first Aliyah, second Aliyah, what do you call Balfour Declaration, British Mandate State. Okay, we have a very smooth nationalist narrative. That nationalist narrative doesn't hold up under scrutiny, in my opinion. Once you go back to the Ottoman period, I see it. We really misread a lot of things, as far as I'm concerned.
So that's let's look at the other side. We know that you mentioned the mistrust and discrimination against Arabs on the part of Turkish officials during the Abdul Hamid period, and an alliance was made between the exiled Young Turks and Arab citizens. And this alliance, however, didn't last long. And I like to perhaps connect this with the Haram al-Sharif incident one of the remarkable chapters in your book. You believe that this event was a critical turning point in modern Palestinian identity. So, would you like to connect these, changes in Arab identity and expectations from Young Turks and the frustrations as well?
Yeah, I think if we want to bring it back to Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi in the 1870s, the frustration that they are going to be parliament members and this parliament is absolved by Abdulhamid II. That's the first thing. And we know that all through the Mashriq, all through Syria and Palestine, so many of them find their home in Egypt, writers, different people wanting to express themselves. At the same time, there's a major migration, less to America, but much more to South America as well. So we see that the 1908 revolution for many Arabs was hope that this was going to change and that they were going to be able to have, the massive explosion of press after 1908 is remarkable, not just in Istanbul, but also in Palestine. What I find interesting is that already by 1909, 1910, Syrian Arabs, in fact, are staunchly defending the opposition, actually. They're very anti-Young Turk. But Palestinians themselves, especially in Jerusalem, have a very close tie with Istanbul. And I really want to figure that out more, because in a way, it puts them on the wrong side of the stick or for their own struggle. Because the CUP was much closer to the Jewish community and the Zionist community and questioning what is the future of all these different peoples there. But still, when they go to the parliament, they actually find the opposition, in a way that they're going against the opposition that is sort of supporting them in a way. I'm talking about the first debates up to 1911. After 1911, we have some, they're losing this. The government's losing the support. But someone like Ruhi al-Khalidi, who dies early, but after his parliamentary membership, he was also appointed a ambassador. I forget where right now. But so they really see their future tied with the Ottoman state. And I think once we understand that, we have this great disappointment. And that disappointment comes back to your question to the pre-1908 period, is that Palestinians are seeing that the Ottomans, including Abdulhamid II, this is very important because, we have this myth that Abdulhamid II didn't sell. Well, it's true. We don't know if he said, I'm never going to sell Palestine. Palestine's not mine to sell. It's the land of my peoples. But we know, so forth and so on. The narrative of Abdulhamid II has been sort of, inflated to show that he was a defender of Palestine. But what we see was that during his period, they're not able to stop Jewish migration to Palestine because of the capitulations. I mean, they have foreign passports. There's not much they can do without causing a major crisis. And we also see this carries over the Young Turk period, the mass amount of corruption among Ottoman officials. So the local population really mistrusts the Ottoman officials. And once again, this is from Abdulhamid II's period. There's no doubt, and this carries on. So, you have the governor, suddenly I forgot his name, during the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. I suddenly forgot his name. I don't know how, but it's the son of Namik Kemal, actually. It's Namik Kemal's son, who is the, in a minute I'll remember his name. It completely lost me right now. But he even writes that we have to be careful here. We have to be careful here because, there might be some opposition forming among the notable families in Palestine. Now that's pretty fascinating if you think about it, right? That they're starting to say what's happening in the Balkans might happen here in Palestine. So I think that's something that is really interesting. Now, what's the Haram al-Sharif incident? Haram al-Sharif incident is when and every time I read it, and by the way, there's 2 new books coming out soon, novels coming out, historical novels more, I would say, One's more history-based, one more, I haven't read it. I'll see them. I only have seen one of them, but it's a fascinating Indiana Jones story, right? They find, and we all sort of think that Indiana Jones is based on the story, by the way. You know, the Ark, the Lost Ark, different things like this. Because they really believe that they're going to find the Ark of the Temple under the Temple Mount on the Haram al-Sharif, the holy compound. So this Captain Parker makes his way to Istanbul, opens up a company, sells shares. He meets first this Finnish researcher who says, I've decoded the Bible. We know where all the treasures of Solomon are. Parker opens up this company. You know, these are really very colonialistic, you know, we can go, but we have one problem. We need to get the Ottomans on our side. And they go to the Ottoman Empire and they write agreements with the finance minister. I talk about Javed Bey, but it was even before Javed Bey that they had, and I think now we're seeing that there's more documents coming out recently to see that they were well connected. And they get permission to dig under the holiest site. Now the Ottomans denied that they knew that they were going to dig right there, because what happens is they worked there 3 years. They're frustrated. And during the Nabi Musa pilgrimage, when most of the Muslims are exiting the city, they actually sneak into the Al-Aqsa compound, this Al-Aqsa compound, where they dig and they're caught. And once the people come back from Nabi Musa, they hear that it's been desecrated. There is a near riot that breaks out, and the Ottomans have to send more troops to keep the city intact. They're really afraid that it's going to turn out to be something more, and Parker has to flee. So yeah, I think this sort of confirmed their ideas that if they don't protect Palestine, the Ottomans aren't going to do it for them. And this includes the pre-Abdul Hamid II period. This tension between them is already very, very clear. Having said that, I said the ties with Istanbul are very close, especially if you compare it to Damascus. And I don't know the answer why that is, but you really see that I think in the post-1908 period, there's new attempts to really create this, to strengthen the bonds between Istanbul through their governors, and they're also upset. They're also upset that governors aren't speaking Arabic, for example, don't know Arabic that well. Okay, it's a very different Palestine. The Ottoman governors are also going to Zionist settlements. And often Arabs, Ruhi al-Khalidi, the parliament leader, would join them. So it's not, everyone knew very clearly what was happening, but their understandings are very different than most of our understandings today. And I think that really is what confuses so much of the narrative.
And your analysis on the debates in the Ottoman parliament in that era, especially after the Haram al-Sharif incident, is really informative. You say the Palestinian parliamentarians were against anti-Semitism and made strong arguments such as Jewish communities' autonomous structures, and yet rising anti-Semitism was detrimental to the Palestinian cause. Could you please explain it?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. There is the emergence of anti-Semitic rhetoric in Istanbul is very strong after the Young Turk period. One of the sources we know is the British consul was helping spread this. And you can go back to the British newspapers and the London Times and read about conspiracies of Jews being behind the Young Turk Revolution. So this idea, I mean, today it's carried over to the modern state and modern Turkey. But if you do a quick search, you write Zionism, Masonluk, Atatürk, then you will see that the first Jewish state was Turkey, and then the second one was Israel, right? We have these conspiracy theories remain intact, and they're revived and strengthened later on by Erbakan also, the prime minister, the Islamist prime minister, sort of the parent party to the current AKP party. So these conspiracies still exist. They're there and everywhere. But interesting enough, they actually emerged in 1909, 1910, 1911. One of them is Abu Ziyad Tawfiq, who we know is pretty upfront anti-Semitic. When his first book, already in the 1880s, Milleti Israeli, right? The Israeli people, meaning the children of Israel, basically. And that the conspiracies are there. After the Young Turk Revolution, they're very, very strong. And many of them were anti-Committee of Union and Progress, the ones that were in charge or behind the Young Turk Revolution, which eventually led to the overthrowing of Abdul Hamid II in the second, in the events in March of 1909. So what we see here is that the Palestinians are saying, no, we're upset with Jewish migration to Palestine because they're trying to create a Yehudistan here, right? A Jewish homeland here. But we have no problem with Jewish people whatsoever. Let them come everywhere in the Ottoman Empire. It's not our problem. Very much like Abdul Hamid II said, Jews can come everywhere but Palestine. But they are going against some really staunchly anti-government people who are promoting anti-Semitism, who in itself are talking about conspiracy theories, which is basically muddling the waters of that conversation of what it means for Palestinians, and that's the fear that they're going to lose their homeland to a Jewish homeland, to Jewish hegemony, or what I call, claiming the homeland. They see the Jewish community receiving more and more autonomy. They're very desperate, and many of them had studied in Jewish schools. Ruhi Khalidi also knew some Hebrew, had been in Alliance at some time, I believe. They knew each other. Jews and Arabs knew each other during this period, and it wasn't just Arab Jews. A lot of work on the intercommunal identities has sort of shown local Jews who were Arabic speaking somehow close to the Palestinians. I say that's mistaken, that overall they were close to Arabs in Egypt, writing to the press in Egypt, Syria, different places, Iraq. But in Palestine, there was really, I think, a clear division. So, when they go to the parliament and they hear the Palestinian members of parliament, both Ruhi Khalidi and Said Husseini, they hear this anti-Semitic rhetoric, and they're saying, no, you're not with us, right? So the group you think would be with them is actually against them. And this, in essence, I argue, led to a much greater struggle they had to make their voices heard. Because they're in the same party as Nissim Mazliach. Nissim Mazliach stands up and says, well, this is anti-Semitism. For the Jews of the Ottoman Jews, they really see the fear that anti-Semitism is going to place them in a position when they have no representation in the future. And it's sadly to say this happens. Sadly to say that by 1912, Karaso Effendi, they say Karaso in Turkish, but Karaso Effendi, Masliach, Nissim Effendi, and other ones, I don't think ever in the history of the 20th century does the Jewish community have so much representation in the Ottoman or in the Turkish parliament. Of course, later on there's members, there's strong people, but this is a really watershed moment that goes really bad, and it ends up bad because of anti-Semitism, pure anti-Semitism. I have to state, this is not anti-Zionism in any form whatsoever, right? It's fear of Jews, fear of them taking over the economy, tying them to Freemasons. Now, what's interesting is that the Palestinians themselves were also Freemasons. That's what I forgot to say. So all the Palestinians are Freemasons themselves. So when they're saying that Zionists and Freemasons are together on this idea that, to take over the empire, Palestinians are saying, no, it's not this. They all have their own lodges. So it really is, once again, and that narrative, more than any place, has been written out of this new narrative of Abdul Hamid II and the Ottoman rule, because that's very anti-Mason also, right? It's very anti-Mason and anti-Zionist and so forth and so on. But it's really a different argument. It needs to be removed from that very clear argument Palestinians were making, that we are afraid that we are losing control over our own future, and that is what worried them more than anything else.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and especially one quote. It's a long one from this parliamentarian debate in your book. Got my attention, and I like to read it here.
Please do.
That's Bartkes Efendi, an Armenian parliamentarian, and in that debate, he says this: "Gentlemen, why is Russia driving the Jews out? Perhaps over there they want to establish a kingdom as well? Why in Austria, Germany, and England are they rising against the Jews? Perhaps over there also is another land of Palestine, over which they want to establish a kingdom? The Ottoman state has never attacked the Jews, so why should they begin now?" Calls of, "This is wrong. Please, this is not wrong. When we say such things about Jews here, if the primitive people outside see a Jew next to them, they'll say this is a traitor. How is this so? They said this first about the Armenians. I'm saying the people shouldn't take a lesson from these words and find an excuse to act against them. Once upon a time, when people complained to the government about the activities of the Armenian nationalists, the Armenians would say in response, what can we do? This nationalist idea has been spread as propaganda throughout the Armenian population. We cannot stop it. It circulates by itself. Now, aren't we faced with exactly the same situation? Calls of, this is different. It's the same. Gentlemen, I'm speaking as an Armenian. I'm afraid that what has happened to me will happen to the Jews. Calls of, that is the problem. And I say this from an Ottoman perspective, not an Armenian one or a Jewish one. Simply, the Jews are in the land of Palestine and the Armenians in the mountains of Anatolia. They are so far apart from one another that I have no reason to do them any special favors. Mm-hmm. And he continues and ending his words. If tomorrow in the land of Palestine or anywhere else, a riot should occur, they'll behead more Armenians than anyone else. Isn't it such an interesting prophecy?
Yeah. No, it's when you read Bartkes Efendi, it's absolutely chilling. You know, he goes on. He says that one Turkish member says, "Are you calling us Vashti? Are you calling us savage?" He says, "No, I'm calling the one that beheaded my father a savage." So first of all, we know very little about Bartkes Efendi. I tried to find out, and I've talked to Armenian scholars, and I think that quote about the fate of his father, we don't know. We know that he ended up dying in one of the first ones that that is exiled from Istanbul and killed on the way, which marks the Armenian genocide, of course. When the intellectuals are forced out of Istanbul in April 1915, right? So what we see is that Bartkes is killed on the way. It's a chilling prophecy, but it actually shows us so much of how much confusion there is over these new identities, over nationalism, over fears of each community, that one community is getting stronger than the others. Now, for Bartkes Efendi, he did not see Jewish immigration to Palestine as a threat to the empire. And in fact, most CUP members during this period also said, sometimes they would say, are we afraid of this small community of Jews? Who are they? Even Abu Ziyad Tawfiq says, well, we're not, they're talking about Jewish homeland in Iraq, though. And he says, well, are you really feel threatened by the Jews? Well, of course not. We'll have them shivering, running away from us, trembling if something happens. So we see that in the parliament debates, that there's a lot of confusion over what Zionism is, over what is the role of non-Muslims in the society. So I'll give you also something interesting, and I before I enter that debate, I remember there is a book by Neville Mandel, which I really think it's my book sort of continues that or rethinks what Mandel wrote in the 70s, and I forget the name of it right now, but it's a Neville Mandel. It's a fascinating book, and when he comes to the debate on Zionism, he gets to Varkes, and he says, "Oh, that's not interesting. That's about Armenians." And then, "Oh, that's about Greeks. That's about Arabs." And then he comes back to Zionism later to discuss the continuation of the debate. So he says they divert into other issues that are not on our topic. And what I did was, once you read that closely, it is very connected to the topic of the future of the empire and where does Zionism. So I think scholars, once again, we're looking where are they talking about Zionism? Oh, that's not Zionism. Let's move on. No, it really is that we see that it's a completely different understanding during that period. And by the non-Muslims, they just saw this as, like he said, they're in the Holy Land and we're in Western Anatolia. This idea of having their homeland within the Ottoman lands, right? The idea for Varkes that it's not an independent Armenistan when they say it, or even people use Kurdistan during this period, right? They're talking about this is sort of a cultural revival, understanding of their new Ottoman identity. Today, when we read that, we read it very differently. Nationalists today love to, call them they were separatists or they were this. But no, someone like Varkes Effendi I think, showed us that, and many others in the parliament during this time, that there was a question of where is the state going, and we know the ending for Armenians. We know that for the Jewish community within the Ottoman lands, the transformation to the modern Turkish state is going to be very, very difficult, and it's not by chance that in 1948. Already after 1934, pogroms in Edirne and the wealth tax in the 40s, that almost 30,000 pick up and leave Turkey and go to the new state of Israel. So I think that is something important. We always talk about the different groups that are fleeing, or Israel's interested in bringing them in, or something like that. Here's a group that's saying we want to go back to the Holy Land, but for them, 20 years before that, there was no borders there. That was part of their worldview. Worldview was that before 1917, there was something called mobility in the region. And you could have someone that goes from Istanbul to Jerusalem and from Jerusalem to Cairo. This includes Palestinians and Jews both. And that mobility is brought to an abrupt end with World War I. And I think that that's perhaps why we don't spend so much time on the Jewish soldiers fighting in the Ottoman Empire, and Palestinians themselves, of course, fighting. But this idea of them being proud Zionist soldiers, it really goes against everything we can imagine in history today, I would say.
Great. In closing, let's fast forward to recent political developments, as you're not only a great scholar of history, but also a great political commentator, regular contributor to Haaretz, and I like to ask this question: do we know how Palestinians perceive the new coalition government? Are they hopeful?
Well, first of all, I think for Palestinians, it's a bit like asking, I compare often between Turkey and Israel, Kurds and Palestinians, and there's huge differences, of course. But it's also asking sometimes a Kurdish person, does it matter if CHP is in power or MHP are in power, AKP is in power, right? And in the end, it doesn't, right? It's going to. So I think for Palestinians, I mean, the claim of that Israel, that the growing claim that Israel, that's now supported by some human rights organization, that is apartheid state is strengthened by the fact that there's so many different categories. So for all Palestinians, whether they're citizens of the state, who remain very suspicious, I would say, of the government, even though the first time they have they have an Israeli Arab Party, which is representing the Palestinian citizens of the state within the parliament, the Ram Party. They remain very suspicious. But when you get to the West Bank, which is under occupation, Gaza, which is under a blockade for the last 2007, I believe. That's not going to change our lives very much at all. And under Jerusalem, where you have this continuing, they're their residents. They're not, Jerusalem was annexed by Israel, and they were given residential status. And that means that they leave for more than 5 years to go to study, they lose their right to even come back. So, we are talking something very different than Turkey. And that, I do comparisons, but in this sense, we're talking about a multi-level of citizenships for one group, one are Israeli citizens. So I think overall, what the major contribution is to this is that it's going to push Netanyahu out. Hopefully, he won't return, and that is going to lead to a recuperation or reorganizing of the Israeli center left and the left parties that are represented in this government also. So it's a mixed bag, right? On one hand, there's a very far right prime minister, Naftali Bennett. We know who he is. We know I'm coming from the left, and we rightly should be suspicious and keep him in check as much as possible. On the other hand, in the government, you have the health minister, and you have Nitzan Horowitz. You also have the Labor Party, Merav Michaeli, that's of the transportation. Tamar Zandberg of Meretz is there. But you also have someone named Gabi Lasky. And Gabi Lasky is someone who's represented Palestinians against the Israeli military courts. And she is a human rights activist that, unlike anyone probably in Israel today, she's probably the most fiercely, a person who's fiercely defended the rights of Palestinians under occupation. So I think having her and all these other people I mentioned in the government is definitely a positive aspect. And hopefully they can gain the trust of the Israeli people. Because what happens is that Netanyahu, to end, did something really good. He delegitimized the left. We have many parallels. I don't need to go there right now. But the delegitimization of the left parties, I think over the 12 years Netanyahu had in power was really substantial. And of course, it didn't start with him. It's been there since the 1990s, and before that, you could argue. But it led to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who wasn't left, but he was center and left, and he was assassinated. So this idea that people can see them in action and see that they are, because in the end, what do people want from government? They want social benefits. They want people that are interested in developing infrastructure, transportation. People look at the transportation portfolio and they say, how is that leftist? Or how is her in the center left, Merav Michaeli? She says, of course, because if you're an hour and a half in traffic every day and you're a worker, well, that your 8 hours turns into 12 hours. Everyone in Istanbul knows that, right? That hours and hours in traffic. So yes, it is a social issue. It's a very social issue to have cheap transportation, or not cheap, affordable transportation. So I think there is some hope for this government. For Palestinians, no, I wouldn't argue this. But what I would say at the end is that we had this brilliant last week conversation at NYU about how the Ottoman period comes into this. And I think we can learn a lot from looking back at the Ottoman period and trying to understand the roots of this. Because everyone's trying to go back and, there's, find tapus. And by the way, a tapu is not going to, if you find a tapu, it's not going to, Jewish people in Sheikh Jarrah bring a tapu and say this is ours, but Palestinians can't bring a tapu and say this was ours. So the inequalities are there already. But I think that breaking these nationalist narratives over time will allow us to understand that a state was not the in sum game of the Zionists during this period. And a lot of what we know is been erased post 1917. And I think we need to go back, break this up, and try to understand it in a new light. And hopefully that will lead us to some understanding. I'm not hopeful, but who would be hopeful nowadays? We're all a bit skeptical. But if we can make our lives better, and in this sense, Palestinians who are under occupation, and hopefully lead to a just solution, whether it's two-state solution or one-state solution, the idea that there's going to be equality between all the people in the land, then let's hope for that one day.
Yes, thank you for your great insights. Professor Fishman, thank you so much for joining me at the House of Wisdom today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the great questions. It's been fabulous. Thanks.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.